The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. Katie Rodriguez moved through Sacred Heart's third-floor ward with a kind of efficiency that made her invisible, the way certain people learn to be small, to take up less space, to slip between the gaps in other people's attention. Her name tape read K. Rodriguez, RN, though the one that used to read Major Rodriguez, Special Forces Medical, had been carefully cut away 20 years ago and sewn into the lining of an old jacket hanging in a locker downstairs. The jacket was faded now, the Special Forces patch barely visible unless you knew where to look. She didn't take it out anymore. That life had taught her that keeping her head down and your hand steady was the closest thing to peace you could find. The ward smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, the kind that had been sitting in the break room carafe since 6 in the morning. It was now 06 for 3. Katie had arrived early, as she always did, her shift not technically beginning until 7, but the patients needing someone who understood that the small things, a chart checked twice, a monitor watched before the alarms blared, a hand on a trembling shoulder, sometimes prevented the catastrophic things from happening at all. She'd learned that in Kandahar, learned it in the field hospitals and the dusty surgical tents, learned it in the 14 hours she spent keeping a bleeding 8-year-old boy alive under fire until medevac came. That boy would be 28 now. She tried not to think about him. Room for 12 was at the end of the corridor, past the nurse's station where Dr. Caldwell's coffee mug sat, ridiculous thing, really, with the words Chief of Medicine in gold lettering that caught the light. He wasn't there yet. The morning rounds didn't start until 8. Katie knocked softly on the frame of 412 and stepped inside, her movements economical, nothing wasted. The patient was awake, staring out the window at the rain-slicked parking lot of Norfolk General, the buildings beyond it just suggestions in the grey November morning. He didn't turn when she entered, not at first. "Good morning," she said quietly, checking the monitors with a glance, heart rate 78, O2 sat 94, blood pressure holding stable. "I'm Katie. I'll be helping with your care this morning." The man turned. He was maybe late 20s, muscular in the way that came from deliberate training rather than circumstance, his left arm bearing 3 military tattoos in the style that certain units favored. His eyes were sharp, present, the eyes of someone who'd seen things and survived them. And his left shoulder bore a scar that branched like lightning, an old shrapnel wound that she would have recognized anywhere because she'd watched a surgeon stitch a boy back together after an IED detonated in an alley in Kandahar, and the pattern of that fragmentation was burned into her memory like a map she'd once drawn herself. He made a gesture with his hand, a question mark shape. "Deaf." Her heart did something complicated in her chest, something she'd trained herself not to do in front of patients. She kept her face still, kept her breathing steady. "I'll get you a notepad," she said, and she heard her own voice, calm, professional, the voice that belonged to a nurse named Katie Rodriguez who'd never served anywhere but hospital wards. But she did something else that morning. Something that Dr. Caldwell would notice, would file away in that careful mind of his like a small piece of ammunition he might use later. After her shift ended at 3, Katie didn't go home. She sat in her car in the parking lot and opened her phone and typed basic ASL into a search bar. She found a tutorial, a hospital volunteer who'd posted videos, a free course through a community college website. For 2 hours, she sat in the break room that smelled like burnt coffee and someone's sad desk lunch, her hands moving through the shapes and positions, muscle memory from somewhere she'd buried deep. Hello. Patient. Help. Understand. It wasn't much. But when she went back upstairs at 5:16 p.m., after most of the day's shift had left and the evening staff was just beginning their rounds, she found room for 12 again. The man was still there. Still staring out the window. Katie stood in the doorway, her hands moving through the sign she'd just learned, clumsy but deliberate. "I want to understand." The man's eyes widened. He sat up, and Katie saw something cross his face, recognition, maybe, or a question being asked in the space between them. He made signs back, quick and fluid, and Katie understood none of it except the emotion behind it. But she stayed. She pulled up a chair. She pulled out her phone and opened a translator app, and they spent the next hour with her typing, him signing, building a conversation one awkward word at a time. That was when Dr. Caldwell came through the open door. He was tall, sharp-featured, the kind of handsome that came with expensive tailoring and a watch that cost more than most people's car payments. His eyes took in the scene, Katie sitting close to the patient, her hand still in mid-sign, the phone on her lap, the intimate arrangement of two people learning to speak to each other. Something shifted in his expression, something calculating. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just watched. Just observed the way Katie's fingers traced the shape of a word she was learning, the way her eyes held recognition of the scar on the patient's shoulder, the way her entire body language screamed a kind of familiarity that had no explanation in her personnel file. "Ms. Rodriguez," Dr. Caldwell said, his voice smooth as oil across water. A word outside. Katie stood, her movements controlled, methodical. She was very good at controlled and methodical. She'd spent 2 decades learning how to make herself appear smaller than she actually was, quieter than she actually was, less dangerous than she actually was. She excused herself with a nod to the patient, and followed Caldwell into the hallway where the fluorescent lights buzzed their insect buzz and the rain hammered against the windows with steady, relentless rhythm. "I notice you're spending significant time with room for 12, Caldwell said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his phone, which was a power move, a way of establishing that this conversation wasn't important enough to warrant his full attention. Using methods that aren't in our protocol. "He's deaf," Katie said. "Communication is important to treatment." "Yes. That's what we have professional interpreters for." Caldwell finally looked at her, and his eyes were the color of ice over deep water. "Not nurses deciding to improvise." Katie took one measured breath. She'd been written up before by men with stars on their collars, men who'd questioned her decisions under fire, men whose authority actually meant something. She'd survived their scrutiny. She could survive this. "I wanted to help," she said quietly. "I'm sure you did." Dr. Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But we maintain certain standards at Sacred Heart. Certain professional boundaries. I think it would be better if you stick to your assigned duties. Vital checks. Charting. Standard care protocols." She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply nodded, and walked past him back toward the stairwell, and that was when Dr. Caldwell made the first of what would become many calculated decisions. He pulled out his phone and called someone. Not yet in anger. Not yet in desperation. Just in cold, quiet strategy. Dr. Caldwell waited until Ahmad's family gathered around the bed. Sister, 2 cousins, his mother in a headscarf pressing her palm against his forehead. The room was full. The moment was public. Perfect. Katie was adjusting Ahmad's fur line when Caldwell entered, his shoes clicking against the tile with the precision of someone announcing himself. He didn't acknowledge her at first. He addressed the family in the careful, slow English he reserved for patients he considered beneath his station. "Your son has been receiving unauthorized communication methods from nursing staff." He let the words hang. Sign language. Gesturing. Informal techniques not approved by this facility. Ahmad's mother looked at Katie, then back to the doctor. Confusion rippled across her face. "I assure you," Caldwell continued, "we have established protocols for patient interaction. Ms. Rodriguez here seems to believe she knows better than hospital policy. She's been creating confusion by teaching your son to expect special accommodations." Katie's hand remained steady on the 4 bag. One measured breath. Her eye stayed on the monitor above Ahmad's bed, watching the steady rhythm of his sinus rate at 72. Normal. Calm. Everything Dr. Caldwell was not. "But I want you to know that I've addressed this," he said, turning slightly so Katie could see his profile. "Ms. Rodriguez has been counseled. She'll be returning to standard communication protocols effective immediately." Ahmad signed something rapid and frustrated. His sister translated, "He says Katie is helping him. He says nobody else listens." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Nevertheless, rules exist for a reason." He turned to leave, paused, and added without turning back, "Some people think a little kindness excuses breaking the law. It doesn't." The silence that followed had weight. Ahmed's mother watched Katie with something like pity. Katie's fingers trembled on the fall line, but only for a second. She withdrew her hand, checked the drip rate one more time, and left the room without meeting anyone's eyes. It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the industrial bleach they used on the counters. Katie had a shift meal she'd packed that morning: chicken, rice, something from home. She sat at the table by the window, the meal untouched in front of her, and opened her phone to scroll through nothing. 3 nurses entered together. Martinez from day shift, Yuki who worked ICU, and Stephanie, the charge nurse who'd worked with Katie for 6 months without incident. They saw her. They gathered their lunches, Stephanie from the refrigerator, Yuki her protein shake, Martinez his takeout container. They didn't speak. They didn't look at Katie directly. But the coordinated movement was unmistakable. A unit executing a maneuver. They left through the same door they'd entered. Not a word. Not an accidental glance. Katie sat alone with her untouched meal and watched the clock on the wall. 2:13 p.m. The second hand moved in a rhythm that felt like a metronome, counting something off. Then Caldwell appeared in the doorway. He was holding a printed sheet. He walked to the bulletin board by the refrigerator, the one where holiday schedules and announcements lived, and he pinned the paper with a surgical precision that suggested he'd rehearsed the motion. He didn't look at Katie. He simply left. Katie stood. Her legs moved first, before her mind caught up. She crossed the break room and read the write-up in the institutional language of bureaucracy. There were copies. 3 of them. 1 pinned to the board. 1 in her personnel file. 1 being sent to HR. She read it twice. Once for the words. Once to let the implication sink in. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist, but not before Caldwell reappeared in the doorway, watching from across the room. His arms were crossed. His expression was a study in calculated satisfaction. Katie looked up. Their eyes met across the break room's fluorescent hum, a sound like angry insects trapped in the ceiling. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She held his gaze steady while that single tear tracked down her cheek. "I've been written up by better men than you, Doctor," she said, her voice level as a horizon. "And they had the courage to do it in private." The words landed like ordnance. Caldwell's face darkened. He opened his mouth, closed it, and turned to leave. But not before Katie saw the flash of something across his features: frustration. Anger. The look of a man who'd thrown everything he had at someone and watched it bounce off. She'd given him nothing. Not a crack in her voice. Not a breakdown. Not even anger. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of composure that made his institutional power feel suddenly thin. For the first time, Katie saw something flicker across Caldwell's face that looked like fear. He left the break room and Katie stood alone, the write-up still pinned to the board behind her. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The part of her that had learned to compartmentalize, to separate the mission from the emotion, the job from the cost, was still in control. But she could feel something else stirring underneath. Something she'd buried for 6 years. Something with muscle memory and reflexes that had saved lives in conditions that would make Norfolk look like a playground. She took her untouched meal and her pride and walked back to the unit. The next shift started at 11 p.m. Katie arrived 20 minutes early, the way she always did. The unit was quiet, the way it always was in the minutes before night shift took over from day. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The monitors beat their steady rhythms. The ventilators wheezed like sleeping machines. She was moving through the supply room at 11:06 p.m. when the intercom crackled. 3 syllables that changed everything. Code blue. Trauma Bay 4. All personnel code blue. The sound moved through the hospital like an electrical current. Feet on tile. Voices rising. The distinct hiss of emergency protocols engaging, equipment being retrieved, codes being called, the controlled chaos of people who'd trained for this moment. Katie's hands were already moving. Clean hands. Gloves. The equipment she'd need. Her body knew before her mind caught up. 12 years of this. 3 deployments. 2 wars. The muscle memory had never left. It just waited. She was in trauma bay in 43 seconds. The patient on the table was a man, mid-50s, pale as paper, his left side slick with blood that was too bright to be anything but fresh bleeding. Caldwell was already there. His hands were on the patient's chest, but they were fumbling. He was ordering a chest tube without the proper setup. He was talking too fast. His movements had the quality of someone who knew the steps but not the reason for them. 14-gauge needle, Caldwell snapped. Second intercostal space. The resident handed him the needle. Caldwell's hand went to the patient's chest, but he was positioning wrong. Mid-clavicular. Wrong. He should have been at the mid-axillary line. Katie was standing 2 feet away and she could see it immediately. Tension pneumothorax. The patient's trachea was deviated. His jugular veins were distended. Caldwell was about to perform a procedure on a patient whose anatomy he'd misread. For a moment, Katie simply observed. The part of her that had learned to wait, to assess before acting, took in the scene. The monitor. The blood pressure dropping. The oxygen saturation that was sliding from acceptable to critical. The needle in Caldwell's hand moving toward the wrong intercostal space. And then muscle memory took over. She didn't remember moving. She simply was there, her hand on his wrist, gentle but immovable. A pressure that communicated without words, stop. Caldwell's eyes snapped to hers. Fury. Disbelief. The audacity of a nurse questioning him in front of the resident, the attending, the entire trauma bay bearing witness. Mid-axillary line, Katie said quietly. 5th intercostal space. That's tension pneumo. The monitor was screaming now. The oxygen saturation had dropped to 78. The blood pressure was 68/42. Ticking clock. ETA to hypotensive collapse, minutes. Maybe less. Caldwell looked at the patient. Looked back at Katie. And Katie watched the moment he understood she was right. She watched the moment that realization collided with his pride. He pushed the needle into the wrong space anyway. Nothing happened. No hiss of escaping air. No sudden pressure release. Again, Caldwell ordered. Moving to try a different location. But Katie was already moving past him, her hand steady as a surgical laser. She found the mid-axillary line. 5th intercostal space. Her fingers located the landmarks the way they'd found them 100 times before in tents and hums and field hospitals where electricity was a luxury. She had the needle in her hand, someone passed it, someone understood what was needed, and she was through the pleura in one smooth motion. The hiss of air escaping. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Oxygen saturation, 84. 89, 94. Blood pressure, rising. 72/48. 78/52. Climbing. The patient's color changed. The panic left his face. The tension in his chest released. The room went dead silent. Caldwell was staring at her. The attending was staring at her. The resident's mouth was open. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The patient's oxygen continued to climb. 97%. Stable. Katie stepped back. Her hands were still steady. Her heart rate was still controlled. She was already compartmentalizing the adrenaline, filing away the muscle memory that had just surfaced, preparing the explanation she would give to Caldwell that would paint this as luck or training or just being in the right place. What none of them knew was that she'd done this before. 20 years ago. Kandahar. A building collapsed by a mortar round. A boy underneath the rubble who would grow up to be the deaf warrior now sleeping in room for 12. She'd stayed with him under fire for 14 hours, keeping his airway clear, controlling his bleeding, reading his vitals by touch and intuition because there were no monitors in the dust and the dark. This was nothing. This was familiar. This was the reason she'd become a nurse in the first place. Caldwell's face had gone pale. His mouth opened and closed. He started to speak, stopped, and then he turned and left the trauma bay without a word. Katie watched him go. And she understood with absolute clarity that she'd just made a mistake. Not medically. Medically, she'd saved a life that Caldwell's incompetence would have lost. But professionally, institutionally, politically, she'd just revealed herself. Ahmed's hand trembled against the fall line. Katie noticed it first, the slight flutter in his fingers, the way his free hand reached up to press against his ribs. Routine exam. Chest X-ray came back clear this morning. Pressure reading normal at 0800. But his oxygen saturation was drifting downward on the monitor. 94, 91. 89, the numbers didn't match the clear films. They never lied, those numbers. Not to her. She was adjusting his pillows when his eyes went wide. Not pain, something else. Something like drowning. His mouth opened. No sound came out. His fingers signed frantically, the movements jagged and desperate, but Katie was already moving. She reached for his wrist, felt the pulse hammering beneath her fingertips, elevated, rapid, thready. His left lung had collapsed. She knew it the way she knew the weight of a rifle or the feel of sand under bootlaces. She knew it because she'd seen it before in a dust-choked compound in Helmand province when a 19-year-old Marine took shrapnel from an IED blast and his ribs fractured in 3 places. Fragmented rib displacement. Tension pneumothorax building in the pleural space. The lung collapsing inward like a fist closing. Every breath making it worse. The collapsed lung pressing against his heart, restricting blood flow. Minutes. She had maybe 6 minutes before his blood pressure bottomed out completely. Katie grabbed the emergency call button, but her hands were already moving toward her lunch bag on the shelf. The bag she'd packed that morning at 0530, the way she'd packed field rations for 20 years. MRE ration pack. She tore it open with her teeth, the plastic ripping clean, and found the medical supplies tucked inside. Sterile water packet. Alcohol prep pad. Tape. She'd prepared for this the day she started here, the way operators prepare for war. Expect nothing. Carry everything. I need you to listen, she said. Her voice had changed. The soft hospital cadence was gone. The tone came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had spent 14 hours under fire in a collapsed building, hand steady while artillery walked across the rooftop. Ahmed's eyes locked on hers. This is going to feel wrong. It's supposed to feel wrong. You trust me? He didn't hesitate. He nodded. She tore open the transparent MRE packaging. The plastic was thicker than ideal, but it would work. It had to work. She taped it across the left anterior chest wall at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the place where a needle could release the pressure, where a field dressing could buy time. The plastic adhered to his bare skin with a soft crackling sound. Her hands moved with the terrifying precision of someone who had done this before, in heat, under fire, while a child screamed in her arms. Katie, what are you? A nurse appeared in the doorway. Rodriguez from the cardiac unit. Katie didn't look up. Call Dr. Chen from trauma. Tell him tension pneumo. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Her voice had that quality, the kind that made people move without thinking, without questioning. Rodriguez disappeared. The O2 sat was dropping. 87, 84. 81, Katie's fingers worked the improvised seal, checking the edges, making sure the tape held flush against the skin. Sweat was beading at Ahmed's temples. His free hand gripped her wrist so hard her bones ached. Good. Pain was information. Pain was data. It meant he was still conscious, still fighting, still present. She positioned herself at his left side, one hand on his shoulder, her body angled so she could watch both his face and the monitor simultaneously. Breathe. Small breaths. The seal will expand slightly with your exhale. That's correct. You're doing this exactly right. The fluorescent panels above flickered their endless drone. The ventilator in the room next door wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Somewhere down the corridor, a call button chimed twice. Normal hospital sounds. But in this room, there was only Ahmed's rapid breathing and the soft beeping of the monitor counting down his deterioration. 78, 76, 74. Come on, Katie whispered. Not to Ahmed. To herself. To the part of her that had spent 3 days behind enemy lines with a bleeding 8-year-old, refusing to let his oxygen saturation drop below 88, refusing to let him slip away. She'd won that fight. She would win this one too. The next breath Ahmed took seemed to catch differently. His shoulders dropped slightly. The panic in his eyes receded by a fraction. The seal was working. The pressure was releasing through the edges of the tape, the air escaping with a soft hiss from the improper fit, which was exactly what they needed. The tension inside his chest was decompressing. 72, 73. 75, 79. That's it, Katie said. Her voice was quiet now, but it carried weight. Authority. Something that made nurses stop in doorways and military operators step in line without a word. Your ribs fractured in the anterior segment. 3 breaks, minimum. The lung collapsed because of the displacement. The seal is buying us time for Dr. Chen to get a proper needle decompression setup running. You're not dying today, Ahmed. I don't allow it. 82, 85. 88, 91. His fingers found her hand. Not signing now. Just holding on. His eyes were searching her face, and Katie felt something old and cold move through her chest. He was beginning to recognize her. Not consciously, not yet. But his body knew. The same body that had pressed against hers in the rubble of that compound while she whispered about his mother and brothers and the dog named Sherlock that waited for him back home. The door burst open. Dr. Caldwell entered, his white coat moving like a sail, his expression already shifted toward irritation at being summoned for what he assumed was another nurse's overreaction. Then he saw Ahmed. The tape. The improvised seal. The monitor climbing. 88, 91. 94. His eyes met Katie's. She was still positioned at Ahmed's side, her hand resting on his shoulder with the kind of proprietary assurance that comes from knowing exactly how much pressure someone can tolerate before the bone fractures again, knowing that a hand in the right place is sometimes better than all the equipment in the hospital. Her scrubs were marked with a small smear of his blood. Her hair had come loose from its clip. Her jaw was set in that particular configuration that came when someone had just made a calculation about life and death and decided to win. Caldwell's face flushed. Not with gratitude. With something that looked like rage. What did you do? His voice cut across the small room like a scalpel. Emergency needle decompression. Contraindicated given his rib fractures, so I improvised a seal from available materials. Katie's voice was clinical now. Professional. She didn't look away from Ahmed's monitor. O2 saturation recovered from 74 to 94%. Pressure supporting normal respiratory mechanics. I've sent for Dr. Chen for proper intervention. The patient required immediate action or he was facing cardiac collapse within 4 minutes. You created a pneumothorax without authorization? You contaminated a sterile field with materials from a... Caldwell stepped forward, his hands already reaching as if to remove the seal. Get away from this patient. Step back. This is my unit. Katie moved without thinking. She positioned herself between Caldwell and Ahmed's chest, her shoulders squared, her weight distributed in a way that made clear she had no intention of moving. The voice that came out was different now, the one that had coordinated casualty evacuation under fire, that had ordered grown men into positions that might kill them, that had earned 2 silver stars before she was 30 years old. You want this patient to survive the next 2 minutes, you stop talking and you listen. The seal is holding pressure. The left lung is re-inflating. His O2 is improving. A contaminated field is better than a dead patient. You move toward him again, I will move you. And we both know I can do it. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting to hammer the windows outside, a storm rolling in fast from the Atlantic, the kind that came without warning in Norfolk. Ahmed's eyes were locked on hers now, and something was shifting behind his expression. Not recognition yet, but something like remembering. Caldwell's face had gone completely still. His hands were suspended in the air, halfway to Ahmed's chest. Behind him in the doorway, Rodriguez had stopped dead, her phone still in her hand, the call to Dr. Chen forgotten. Katie kept her voice level. The patient needs Dr. Chen. I need someone to watch the monitor. And you need to decide whether you're a doctor or whether you're just a man with a title who's afraid of being proven wrong by someone he's already decided is beneath him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply waited, the way soldiers wait before an operation, patient, centered, understanding that the next few seconds would determine everything. What happened next would be the moment Caldwell realized what he'd been standing next to the entire time. The moment his calculated moves against a quiet nurse suddenly looked like something else entirely, a man trying to bury evidence before a secret walked out of a hospital room and changed his entire existence. Caldwell didn't hesitate. He sat at his desk with the door closed at 2:13 in the afternoon, and his fingers moved across the phone like a man conducting a symphony of destruction. The first call was to the hospital administrator, Gerald Finch, who owed him favors from a malpractice settlement 3 years back. His voice was calm, practiced, the tone of a man who had orchestrated departmental removals before. We have a nurse creating liability. She's performing unauthorized procedures, circumventing established protocols. I need her reassigned or transferred immediately. Yes, today. The administrator's voice on the other end was small, compliant. Caldwell ended the call and didn't pause. His finger found the next number without hesitation. HR Susan Levine picked up on the second ring, and he laid it out with surgical precision. I'm filing a formal complaint. Unauthorized medical intervention. Deviation from standard of care. I need documentation of every protocol violation on record. The words came out as efficiently as medication through a needle, measured, deliberate, lethal. Levine stammered something about investigation procedures, but Caldwell was already making the third call before her objections could land. The third call went to Dr. Marcus Webb at Seattle General, a colleague who collected favors like some men collected watches. Marcus, I have a problem employee. Skilled enough on the surface, but reckless. Insubordinate. I can have her transferred to your facility by week's end. Yes, she'd be someone else's responsibility. Webb agreed without asking questions. That was the nature of the network Caldwell inhabited, men protecting men, doors opening for the right people and slamming shut for everyone else. By 2:02 p.m., the machinery was in motion. 3 calls. 17 minutes. Katie's civilian life had been mathematically dismantled while she was in the supply room restocking gauze. The escorts arrived at 3:22 p.m. 2 security officers, neither of whom would meet her eyes, and a woman from HR holding a manila folder like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Katie was in the break room when they found her, sitting alone because the other nurses had learned to leave when she arrived. The official language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to feel like procedure and not like a public execution. Your medical license is under temporary review. Unauthorized procedures violate our standing protocols. We're asking you to surrender your badge and accompany security to clear your locker. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Katie stood without argument, and that was the thing that made it worse, her silence, her compliance, the way she didn't fight or plead or defend herself. She simply accepted the folder with her name on the outside and let herself be led down the corridor while staff members found sudden reasons to be anywhere else. The locker clearing took for minutes. Her name tape on the door, just for Kate Rodriguez, came off cleanly. The scrubs folded into a cardboard box. A water bottle. A photograph of her and her husband at Fort Benning, the one where his arm was around her shoulders and neither of them was smiling, as if they both knew something the camera didn't. And then her fingers found the jacket hanging in the back, the one she never wore on shift because it was worn soft at the elbows and carried the weight of 2 decades. She pulled it out carefully, folded it into the box, and the security officer didn't stop her. They didn't know what they were letting her take. The faded Special Forces patch was stitched into the lining where no one could see it unless they were looking for proof of something that had already been surrendered. Caldwell's carefully constructed paper trail made sure her explanations never landed. Every document in that folder was perfectly legal, perfectly positioned, perfectly designed to make her look unstable. The write-up about the MRE seal was labeled unauthorized improvisation in a non-emergency setting. Her attempt to learn sign language was documented as deviation from established communication protocols. The patience, the care, the 14 hours she had once spent keeping a bleeding child alive under sniper fire, none of that existed in the official record. Only the violations remained. Security walked her to the parking garage. The afternoon light filtered through the concrete levels in institutional grey, and her heels clicked against the floor like a metronome counting down something ending. She didn't speak to the officers. She didn't ask questions or request clarification. She simply carried the box to her car, set it on the passenger seat, and sat in the driver's position with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing for 6 minutes before she started the engine. The rain started on the drive to Riverside Cemetery, light at first and then heavier, until the windshield wipers couldn't keep pace with the deluge. She parked near the south entrance and walked without an umbrella. The rain soaked through her scrubs, cold against her skin, and she didn't care. The headstone was granite, black, with his name and dates and nothing else because there was nothing else to say. Major James Rodriguez. 1979 to 2019, 5 years gone, and sometimes it felt like yesterday and sometimes like another lifetime. She stood in front of the grave for a long time, rain running down her face and mixing with tears she hadn't intended to cry. "I tried to be normal for you," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way it hadn't cracked in front of Caldwell, in front of Ahmad, in front of anyone who was watching. "Tried to let it go. Tried to be someone ordinary, someone who didn't carry what we carried. I thought if I put on scrubs instead of fatigues, if I saved lives in climate-controlled rooms instead of under fire, it would be different. It would be enough. It would be safe." The rain hammered down like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. "But I failed. I always fail the people who need me most. Ahmed needed someone who could see him, really see him, and instead I got us both destroyed. I failed you. I failed him. I failed every person depending on me to just stay quiet and small and invisible." She pressed her forehead against the rain-slicked stone, and her shoulders shook with the kind of breathing that soldiers learn to hide. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She drove to the apartment in silence, the cardboard box still on the passenger seat, the jacket with the patch inside somehow heavier than it had been that morning. The rain followed her all the way home, drumming against the roof of her car like a metronome counting down to something she couldn't yet see. She had been medically discharged 8 years ago when an IED took her hearing in her left ear and shattered her left leg in 3 places. The reconstruction had taken 2 surgeries and 8 months of physical therapy, and when she was cleared for light duty, she had made a choice that seemed simple at the time: walk away. Don't re-enlist. Don't take another contract with the CIA, build something civilian. Have a normal life. Have a life where you didn't wake up running calculations of cover and ammunition and line of sight. A life where you could sleep without hearing the static of a radio in your dreams. She had rebuilt herself as Katie Rodriguez, registered nurse, quiet competence in scrubs, a woman whose biggest emergency was managing difficult physicians and maintaining hospital protocols. She had succeeded at that until she hadn't, until Ahmed walked into Sacred Heart and the past had simply decided to collect what it was owed. The apartment was dark when she entered, the kind of dark that comes at 6 p.m. on a rain-soaked evening in November. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the edge of the couch with a cardboard box beside her and pulled out the jacket, ran her fingers over the patch where the stitching was slightly uneven because she had done it herself during a recovery rotation at Fort Bragg. Special Forces Medical. 18 years of that. 18 years of being trusted with other people's lives, of knowing how to stop the bleeding when the bleeding wouldn't stop, of understanding that hesitation kills and mercy is a luxury for people who aren't holding a 14-year-old boy's femoral artery together while rounds are coming through the wall. She had made a choice that the medical license under review, the security badge deactivated, the perfectly constructed paper trail documenting her incompetence could erase in an afternoon. She held the jacket like it was the only thing holding her together, and for exactly 17 seconds, she considered throwing it away. Burning it. Letting the whole thing go, the patch, the memories, the weight of every life she had ever been responsible for. It would be so much easier. It would be clean. No more pretending. No more trying to be something she was not built to be. And then her phone vibrated against the coffee table. A text from an unknown number. 8 words, stand by. Help is en route. Confirm receipt. Her hand steadied. The trembling that had threatened to take over her body simply stopped, as if a switch had been flipped, as if something dormant deep inside her had woken up and remembered how to function in a crisis. The rain hammered against the windows, but in the distance, beneath the sound of the storm, she heard something else. A rhythmic thumping, growing closer, the distinctive percussion of rotor blades cutting through wet air. The sound of a helicopter moving toward Norfolk with purpose. She looked at the jacket, at the patch, at 18 years of identity she had tried to bury. And she waited. The Black Hawk appeared on the horizon at 0551, rotors cutting the Norfolk dawn like a blade through water. Katie heard it before she saw it, that distant thump-thump-thump of heavy lift blades, the sound that used to mean either salvation or catastrophe depending on which side of the wire you were standing on. She was in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot, still in yesterday's scrubs, when the helicopter descended toward the emergency pad with the controlled violence of military precision. She knew that sound. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. The aircraft touched down at 0604. Through the windshield, she watched 6 figures in tactical gear disembark, moving with the economical grace of operators, the kind of synchronized discipline that comes from 1,000 hours of training together. They walked past the security checkpoint like the building belonged to them, like doors and badges were suggestions rather than barriers. The lead operator was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change around him. His call sign was probably Reaper or Hammer or something equally clinical. Katie knew that look. She'd worn that look once. The SEAL team walked straight to the information desk. The receptionist, a young woman named Melissa who'd always been kind to Katie during her exile, pointed toward the elevators. They didn't take the elevators. They went to the stairwell instead, moving like they were searching for a specific location. Katie watched them disappear into the building, her heart accelerating into a rhythm that had nothing to do with caffeine. She sat in the parking lot for 42 seconds. Then she got out of the car. The lobby was chaos by the time she reached it, hushed chaos, the kind where nurses and administrative staff moved in urgent circles, phones ringing, someone saying I don't know who they are and someone else saying that they walked past me like I wasn't there. Katie kept her head down, moving through the crowd with the invisibility she'd perfected over 18 years. Just another person in yesterday's clothes. Just a ghost walking through a building that had already fired her. And then Ahmed walked out of the stairwell. He was tall now, broader through the shoulders than he'd been even 2 days ago, or perhaps Katie had simply never noticed how much of a man he'd become under the identity of patient. He wore black tactical gear with no insignia, and his hands moved in rapid, precise signs that Katie's 14 hours of YouTube tutorials had barely prepared her to understand. But she caught the words anyway. The ones that mattered. Major Rodriguez. Special Forces. Kandahar. 2004. A translator walked beside him, speaking the signs aloud. Major Rodriguez, Special Forces Medical. She saved my life. Kandahar, 2004. 14 hours under fire. Never left me. Katie felt her legs stop working. She was dimly aware of her body still moving forward, but it felt separate from her, a vessel operated by someone else's muscle memory. Ahmed's eyes found hers across the lobby, and something shifted in his expression, recognition, and underneath it, the echo of a scared 8-year-old boy in a collapsed building, reaching for steady hands that wouldn't let him go. The SEAL commander turned. His eyes were the color of winter water, and they locked onto her with the precision of a targeting laser. He was holding a folder, manila, unmarked. His voice carried across the lobby like a command, Major Rodriguez. It wasn't a question. Nobody called her Major. Nobody had called her Major in 20 years. The word sat in the air between them like a live round. Katie didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice to remain steady, and she'd learned long ago that silence was often the only response that wouldn't betray you. The SEAL commander closed the distance between them in 4 strides. He extended the folder. We have a situation. Bethesda. A senator's son. Deaf operator. IED trauma 14 months ago. He's refusing treatment from anyone but the legend who saved Ahmad here. The medic who earned 2 silver stars and a Distinguished Service Cross for staying behind enemy lines with a wounded child for 3 days. The commander's eyes never left hers. That's you, isn't it, Major? Katie took the folder. Her hands were steady, that part of her hadn't forgotten how to function under pressure. 20 years of rebuilding, of choosing to be invisible, of burying every instinct that made her dangerous, and it all dissolved the moment someone reminded her that she'd been extraordinary. Sir, she said quietly, I was terminated yesterday. Not anymore, the SEAL commander replied. You're under federal contract as of 0612 this morning. And you're coming with us. Everything after that happened in fragments. Katie was aware of Dr. Caldwell emerging from the administrative corridor, his face draining of color as he saw the tactical operators, saw Ahmad, saw the commander's hand resting on her shoulder like a benediction. She was aware of him turning and walking rapidly back toward his office. She was aware of the look on his face, not anger anymore, but something closer to panic. The look of a man who'd just realized he'd been playing checkers against a chess grandmaster. For minutes later, FBI agents in blue windbreakers were walking past Katie without a glance. She heard them before she saw them, the percussion of boots on tile, that specific cadence that meant federal authority. She was already moving toward the lobby exit with the SEAL commander and Ahmad when the first agent descended the stairwell from Caldwell's office, moving with the controlled intensity of someone who'd just discovered something that mattered. The perp walk happened at 0638. Dr. Caldwell's wrists were small, Katie noticed, the wrists of someone who'd never had to dig through wreckage with his bare hands, never had to hold pressure on a wound while rounds snapped past his head. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound like a coffin closing. An FBI agent read him his rights while the staff of Sacred Heart watched from behind desks and doorways, their silence more eloquent than any words. The agent escorted Caldwell past the nurse's station where several of the staff who'd left the break room when Katie sat down watched him go. Their faces held no triumph, just a kind of exhausted recognition. They'd been wrong about her. They'd let themselves be wrong about her. The weight of that would follow them differently than it followed Caldwell. They'd have to live with the knowledge of what they'd chosen. He'd have to live with federal charges for falsifying medical records and obstruction of a national security matter. The FBI agent walked him out through the main entrance, and that was the last Katie saw of Dr. Caldwell at Sacred Heart Hospital. The next 2 years compressed into moments. Katie's security clearance reinstated. Her medical license restored. Ahmad healing in ways that had less to do with medicine and more to do with finally being seen, finally being known. The SEAL commander, whose name was Marcus Halloway, but everyone called him Breaker, checking in on her progress with the kind of regularity that suggested he'd appointed himself her unofficial guardian. And then she was standing in an office at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, the faded Special Forces patch from her old jacket lining finally framed on the wall behind her desk. The patch was threadbare, the green and black colors faded by time and desert sun, but it was there. Visible. No longer hidden inside jacket linings or buried in lockers. Her major's insignia was framed beside it, bright oak leaves that caught the light. She was briefing a new generation of combat medics, 23 men and women in Class 34 of the Special Operations Combat Medic course, on field techniques for tension pneumothorax under fire. The last slide on her presentation was a photograph, her and Ahmad. In the photo, he was signing, his hands creating shapes that meant angel in ASL. His face was young again, unmarked by the weight of survival. Katie stood beside him in her dress uniform, the oak leaves on her shoulders catching the same light that was now catching them in this classroom. She didn't smile in the photo, but her eyes held something that looked like peace. Questions, she asked the class. One of the medics, a woman named Torres with the build of a wrestler and eyes that had seen combat, raised her hand. Major, when you realized you had to choose between staying hidden and stepping back into who you were, what made you choose? Katie looked at the photograph. At Ahmed's young face. At the woman in uniform she'd been, and then the nurse she'd become, and now the instructor she was. I didn't choose, she said quietly. He did. When he needed me, he chose. When the mission came, I answered. That's how it works in this life. You don't get to retire from being who you are. You just get to decide what you're going to do about it. The class took notes. Katie dismissed them at 11:30, and they filed out, and she stood alone in the classroom with the photograph and the framed patch and the weight of continuity. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the echo of restraint finally released, the knowing that you'd chosen the harder path and found it to be the true one. She had no idea that by next year, she'd be directing the entire trauma program at Walter Reed. She had no idea that Ahmad would start his own organization helping deaf veterans navigate the transition to civilian life, or that he'd credit her mentorship in every interview he gave. She had no idea that somewhere in Tucson, in a small strip mall, a man named Steve, formerly Dr. Caldwell, was mopping floors at an urgent care clinic, flinching whenever anyone called him doctor, the sound of his own name becoming a daily reminder of the cost of underestimating quiet people with nothing left to lose. What she did know was that this was exactly where she needed to be. The patients in Walter Reed's trauma unit knew her name by reputation now. They asked for her specifically, not as a nurse, but as a major. They asked for the woman who'd spent 20 years learning to save lives in 2 different wars, 2 different uniforms, 2 different versions of herself. They asked for the one who understood that sometimes the greatest battle isn't the one everyone sees, but the one you fight against yourself every single day to choose courage over comfort. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Katie understood that now in a way she never could have before. The patients who came through these doors, soldiers with shattered bodies and scarred minds, they didn't care that she'd been a major. They cared that she knew, in a way that came from experience rather than training, that survival wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the one who refused to let go. Tell me, if you'd been standing in that lobby when Ahmad walked out of that stairwell and his hands began to move in sign language, spelling out the name of someone you tried to forget, would you have run? Or would you have answered the call, knowing it meant everything you'd buried would have to rise? Subscribe for the next story, and never stop asking yourself what you're capable of becoming when you stop running from who you've always been.